I'd like to invite the panelists for the health privacy panel to come up to the stage and sit with their name tag. And this panel, along with all the other panels, will be structured in the same way. After all the panelists are introduced, they'll all speak in sequence, and we'll leave discussion and questions for the end after all the panelists have had a chance to present. As the panelists are coming up, I'll begin introducing them. First, Dr. Yann Joly, directeur de recherche.
Yann Joly, lawyer emeritus from the Quebec Bar and the research director of Center of Genomics and Policies. He is an associate professor at the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Human Genetics at the Bioethics Unit at the McGill University. He is a research fellow from the Fonds de Recherche du Québec Santé. He also works as an ethics and legal consultant in the private sector. He has served as legal advisor on several ethics committees in the public and private sectors. He received the Quebec Bar Award of Merit Innovation for his work on the right to privacy on the biomedical field. He is going to talk about research as a directing principle for analysis of genomic data in the cloud-based
at University of Waterloo School of Pharmacy, and also a licensed and practicing pharmacist. Her research includes novel ways to bring research findings to today's busy medical clinics and pharmacy counters, namely through innovations in mobile technologies. Dr. Kelly Grindrod completed her pharmacy degree at University of Alberta, a hospital residency at the London Health Sciences Centre, a PharmD, a Master's of Science degree, and a postdoctoral fellowship at University of British Columbia. She will present about her OPC-funded project, the reliability of security options for mobile health applications designed for use with older adults with chronic disease. Amy Conroy, a PhD student at University of Ottawa, completed previous graduate and undergraduate background in law, economics, and psychology. Her doctoral research considers the emerging issue of familial searching of DNA in the criminal context from a critical race theory perspective. The thesis examines the equality issues in particular, along with the potential implications for the right to privacy and to life, liberty, and security of the person. Amy will present on genetic junk DNA and collection and the future of Canada's National DNA Bank. Derek Jones is a health lawyer, lecturer, and scholar. A graduate of Harvard and Yale, he works at the interface of human rights, health sciences, and ethics. At McGill, he's a member of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, a member of McGill's research group on health law, and has taught health law and bioethics, psychiatry and law, AIDS law, comparative medical law, nursing law, and ethics. He's collaborated as senior advisor to government, professional, university, and international bodies, including Justice Canada, Health Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Law Reform Commission of Canada, and UNESCO. He was founding director of the Interagency Advisory Panel and Secretariat on Research Ethics, which played a leading role in the revision of Canada's national standards for the ethical conduct of research involving humans. Colleen Sheppard est la directrice du Centre
is a director for the Center of Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and professor at the Faculty of Law at McGill University. She holds a degree and a law degree at the University of Toronto and a master's in law from Harvard University. She was a legal assistant for Chief Justice Dickson at the Supreme Court of Canada. Her teaching and research deal with human rights, equality of rights, and equality in the workplace, and comparative constitutional rights and feminist legal issues. Beyond her commitment and research, she took part in public interest project. She was commissioner at the Human Rights Commission and Youth Rights Commission in Quebec from 91 to 96. And was a special advisor to the Federal Minister of Justice at the National Institute of Magistrature and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Association of the Aboriginal Métis Association International Labour Organization. Derek.
Mental health information, privacy, and equality in the workplace. Without further ado, we'll get started.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure to present here this morning at this symposium, and I want to start by thanking Madeleine for initiative and leadership in organizing this terrific symposium together. I had the pleasure of working with Madeleine for several years at the University of Montreal, not too long ago, and it's just fantastic to see how much she's grown into her new occupation here at the University of Ottawa. I also want to acknowledge Adrian Thorogood for helping me putting out this presentation together. So I will talk about a project of our center called Protecting Privacy in Cloud-Based Genomic Research. It's a project that was part of the 2014-15 competition funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And the objective of the project was to identify the core element for an optimal privacy governance framework for the storage and sharing of genomic data in the cloud. And I will first explain how we got there, how we got to thinking about sharing genomic information through the cloud, what are the issues this raises, and I will discuss a little bit about the kind of analysis that we conducted. The project is still ongoing, which means that I will likely raise more questions than I will provide answers this morning, but I will hopefully get you interested in the topic and the method we're using and give you some hints of where this is all going. So, why is genomic research becoming so important, and why has it been polarizing the attention of health specialists in recent years, and why are we going towards big data? Well, there's several reasons why large-scale genomic research is becoming so important. The first one is that the traditional pharmaceutical model of research and development it has become too expensive and insufficiently innovative to be the only path to new therapeutic products. It's costing more and more to pharmaceutical companies to come up with less and less. I mean, sure, they're still making a healthy margin of profit, but we see very few new innovative products coming out of the market these days, and new types of research are needed, and genomics offer interesting alternative there to generate new tests. We're talking about predictive tests, we're talking about diagnostic tests, and it also can offer a solution to develop new medication, to find new uses for old medication, or to better dose drugs to the profile of each individual. So this is the promise of genomic research, and there's also this growing consensus in the community that combining and sharing genomic data and other types of medical data sets should generate the required statistical power to accelerate discovery and translate research finding into clinical medical practice. So especially for the kind of research that we're undergoing right now in genetic research, we need large population group. We want to get as many research participants as possible from a large geographical region so that we can have people coming from different population group, so that we can have rare genotype if we're doing research into orphan disease, for example. Now, this is the premise as to why we want to go to genomic research and why we want to go to big data genomic. And we can question some of these premises. For example, it is true that the clinical impact of genetic research remains fairly modest to these days. Although things do seem to be picking up. I mean, the last few years we've seen more translational research getting done. We've started to see some of the first few personalized drugs coming up into the market. So things are looking better, but we can ask ourselves, are we setting our priority right in investing so much money in biotechnological research? Data sharing too has its critique. Is it really the right way or the only way to do research, to share data in such large quantity over the internet, for example? It raises methodological question in the way that we share. Are we sharing it in the right way? It also raises issue as to the content, the quality of the data that we are sharing. We are in such hurry to share the data, but is the quality of the data we're sharing there right? And finally, on the underpinning philosophy, are we doing this out of solidarity? Is there something to gain out of sharing big data? So these are all valid questions that I don't want to reject there, but I will work on the premise here that genomic research is an interesting opportunity to advance medicine, and that big data sharing is one of the best way right now to advance this research forward. So why do we want to go to the cloud? Well, the cost of sequencing is falling rapidly. What does that mean? It means that once upon a time, you would get a few genes sequenced. It would take days, would be very expensive. So you'd get little information, little data, at a very expensive cost, and it would be time-consuming. Now we can have whole genome sequence. Doesn't take too long. It's becoming more and more affordable. And so what that means is we're getting more and more genetic data available. We're talking about, as you can see there, 100 gigabyte of data for a whole human genome sequence. And when we're talking about project utilizing thousands of genome, we're talking petabytes of data. And what that means for a researcher, and I can give you a very concrete example right here, right now, which is one of the large consortium, one of the most important research consortium in genomic these days, is called the International Cancer Genomic Consortium. It's a consortium that regroups members from more than 15 countries working on over 70 research projects, and they have data available from over 15,000 cancer genomes. We're talking 1.5 petabytes of data. And to download it and analyze it through traditional means, which is basically through your own local computer server, would actually take years. So the cloud is the only solution if you want to pursue that kind of large-scale research. There is just no other options currently than cloud computing for this type of research. So it's either we decide that we do not want to pursue this as a society, or if we do, cloud is the only option. Why? What does cloud computing offer? Well, it offers scalable service and basically storage space to store genetic sequence information, and when you can process it and virtually analyze it. So I'm going to give a definition. I'm not a big fan of giving definition, but since cloud computing is the theme of this presentation, I thought I would sort of give the more well-known definition of it, which is the definition given by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They define cloud computing as a pay-per-use model for enabling convenient, on-demand network access to shared pool of configurable computing resources that can rapidly be provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. Now, what does that concretely mean? And I suspect if you ask the lay public, what do they think cloud computing means? When you tell them we're going to put your data in the cloud, what does it mean? Well, it basically means that you're going to rent space from a company, and that space basically could be anywhere in the world. The company can have its head office in the US, but they'll have server space everywhere. The data can be shifted from one place to another so that a convenient location can be found, and you can analyze the data from a distant location. And the idea of all of this is really that with more space and with more computing capacity, you will be able to do things faster from a distance. So this is from a paper that I had published with my colleague Edward Dove last year, it's basically a graphic comparison of a schematic comparison of the old model of analyzing genetic data with the new model using cloud computing. Now, of course, cloud computing looks great from a scientific perspective, but it does bring several issues for lawyers and ethicists. Among these issues, I hinted to that, is the fact that the location of the data is shifted from one place to another by those large cloud computing company, which means that the legal regime applicable to the data might change as well. It's also about who's responsible for the data. So should there be a breach of confidentiality? Who incurs responsibility? Should the commercial provider, so should Google go bankrupt one day, which doesn't look very likely today, but things can change. Or should Google decide they don't want to do business with me anymore? What happens with my data? Do I get to retrieve my data? Do I get a certain amount of time to retrieve my data? Is my data deleted from their servers? So all these questions, and there are many, are raised by cloud computing nowadays. And so the objective of our project is to define what's the Canadian governance framework, both the laws and the policies that currently applies to cloud computing. Then we want to compare this legal framework with the legal framework that applies in the United States and the European Union. And once we have done that, we also set to analyze the privacy policies and the terms of service of 6 cloud computing companies. And among those companies are Google, Amazon's, Bionimbus. So we have several private cloud providers, DNA Nexus, Cloud Sigma, and also Rackforce Network are the ones that we've selected. And we want to basically see, okay, what are those, those cloud, those terms of service are basically contract. So do they offer additional protection from what's already offered in the law? Is that different? Is that sufficient, insufficient? Where are the gaps, and how can we patch those gaps, and how can we develop our own Canadian framework that will help research to proceed in a safe way for the participant? So looking at the legal regime that we had selected to analyze, so the Canadian approach to privacy is really based, if you look at PIPEDA, for example, on an accountability model for data transfer, where the data custodian, the person that's responsible for the data, that collects the data and that stores the data, and the cloud provider, once the data is transferred to the cloud, would remain accountable post hoc for the resulting effects of their data transfer within and across international borders. So there's this chain of responsibility. In Europe, it's quite a different model. Europe has what we call an adequacy model. It's a preventive approach to data transfer. So basically, it requires that the privacy protection that you're offering be adequate, be judged adequate before you can actually they can actually share data with you. And of course, those adequacy decisions have been some of them quite controversial. For example, the Canadian legal framework has been judged adequate, but the Quebec framework, which is really equivalent, has been judged as not being adequate, which really raised a lot of question in the community. And also, we have to understand that data protection is seen as a fundamental right in the UN Charter, in the EU Charter, sorry. So that also makes it quite a different regime from the Canadian regime. The US is also another very different example. They have a sectoral approach, meaning that they have specific protection for health data, and they also have quite a complex approach to cloud computing. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, have started to very seriously look into this. So far, only one company in the United States has been able to offer cloud computing service that meets the requirement of the National Institute of Health. It's Bionimbus. And so looking at those three legal regimes raises some very interesting questions, and that's what we're doing right now is analyzing some of that data. I'm going to skip over that slide on genomic data for the interest of time, because I do want to mention some of our finding on the terms of service of the various cloud provider. So what we found is that the way that they defined personal information was quite different from one contract to another. They could define it in a fairly circular way, which is basically saying that personal information is information about a specific individual, so not really informative, legislatively driven, meaning based on the law of the country where the company has its operation, or sometimes they would have genetic-specific definitions of what constitute personal information. So, for example, genomic information that can reasonably identify a specific individual. What's also interesting is that if you look at the first, the big cloud computing companies, I mean, most of them develop their rules, their policies with financial data in mind, not with health data in mind. So it's actually, when you look at those contracts, and the contract they would like to use, because now their attention has turned to health data, and they are certainly happy to offer their services for health data, these contracts are really made for financial data in mind, and so there's very broad limitation and exclusion clause on liability, which are deemed problematic by many health researchers with good reason. It's also, as I was mentioning, all those cloud providers function on the premise that they can actually shift the data that they're storing from one country to the other where they actually have storage space, and they don't even have to tell you that they're going to change where your data is stored. Of course, you can decide, you have sometimes a limited right to select a place of permanent storage, meaning this is where the information, the data is going to be stored by default. Doesn't mean they won't switch it to another place eventually, but it means this is sort of the default place where the information will be stored. So what are some of the thoughts that I want to leave you with today that we're right now reflecting upon in the context of this project? So the first one is, our Canadian laws and policy adequately framed to ensure safe, efficient practice of genomic research in the cloud? And that was our objective, if you'll remember. So this one is not really surprising. Do we need to negotiate terms of service with corporate giants that are more specifically designed with health data in mind? So this is the idea that we're talking about Google and Amazon. These are corporate giants. Can the health research community actually have a chance? Do we need, first of all, are the terms of service they're offering right now sufficient to provide the security and confidentiality of health data that we desire? And if not, how do we go about negotiating better terms as a community? And finally, and this is something that's troubling me the most, is what kind of information do we need to provide patient and research participant about possible transfer of genetic and clinical data in the cloud? As I mentioned, I don't think most of the people in Canada have a very solid idea of what it means to have their data stored in the cloud. And I think So when you look at consent form that people are signing to participate in research and that we're using right now, most of those consent forms were designed at the time where cloud computing was not considered as an option. So they were not informed that their data would one day be put in the cloud. So now do we need to reconsent those thousands of participants? And you can imagine the cost that would be linked to reconsenting all those participants and just to inform them that their data will now be stored in the cloud. Is that something we should do? Is there alternative way of doing it that would be more efficient, but at the same time sufficiently informative that people would be aware of what's happening? And finally, one of the phenomenon we see caused by the regulation being so different between the European Union, the United States, Canada, other countries, is we start to see data silos getting built up, regional data silos. So everybody wants to share data in the scientific community, but everybody wants to share data on the condition that data remains distributed on the condition that are decided by their country or by their region. And so it makes it actually quite difficult to share the data efficiently. So how can we open up those silos, and what kind of level of legal harmonization can we achieve on the international sphere? So that's one of the last issues we wish to address with this project. On that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and also to acknowledge all the members of the research team that are mentioned here: Edward Dove, Mark Phillips, Howard Simkevitz, Lincoln Stein, and Barton Oppers. Thank you.
My name's Kelly Grindrod. I'm a pharmacist. I'm not a privacy person. I'm a privacy person, I guess, by accident. Because part of being a pharmacist is that I deal every day with highly, highly sensitive information and data. And as part of my research, I actually am in the area of mobile health. I'm at University of Waterloo, which many know more as a computer science university than a health university. And one of the things I started to realize when I got into mobile health was that, again, I'm a pharmacist. I see patients. I see people. And I would go into this space and I get asked to talk at conferences and, what are the great apps out there? What should we be recommending to our patients? What should health providers have? And I kept hitting this wall and thinking, I don't know. None of it reflects the patients I see in front of me. Patients and people who are sick, is probably a better way of putting it, are a very specific group of people. They're people who have very specific needs. And technology is growing like crazy. But it's in the area of mobile health, it's growing like crazy without reflecting the people who are meant to use it. If you need it, there's a copy of my slides on my Twitter account. I tweeted it with the hashtag. It's through HaikuDeck, so in there, all the comments, there's references and links to the papers and stuff that I'm going to talk about. So if you'd like to see that, feel free to go check that out. Here's the bottom line, what I'm going to go through, and it's that mobile health information is private. Very private, and it needs to be secure. But to a person who is sick, access or accessibility is at least as important as security. We need to secure it because it's private, but we need to let you get into it at the same time. Healthcare is different from other industries because health is private. This has taken me a year to understand why in financial services and banking we have all these great apps, and in healthcare we have crap. We don't have good stuff. And I couldn't figure out why, and it was privacy experts saying, but you have to understand, health information is private. You don't report your health information on your taxes every year. There are no sunshine lists of diseases that come out. We don't share that information, it's sensitive. But in healthcare, bad security design can be the enemy of privacy, because what happens is if you cannot get that information quickly and easily, you find a workaround. You have a lock and you find a key and you leave the key in the lock, and the lock basically becomes a handle to turn that door. The best example I got of this was recently talking to a colleague who's an emergency room physician, and at their computer and their electronic medical record, they have this password. It's one of these complex passwords, and the IT department had decided that this individual, or this hospital, was going to have to change that password every 2 weeks, and you couldn't reuse the same password any of the last 10 times. Any of the last 10 passwords, you couldn't reuse it. Ridiculous. Absolutely, because this is an emergency room physician. If anybody in the world needs information right now, it's an emergency room physician. So what they did was took a yellow Post-it note, unsurprisingly, wrote the password on it, and stuck it on the computer. The lock became a handle. So good mobile health design then, for it to have good security in there, it must be accessible to the users, otherwise a lock becomes a handle. This also means, though, that who we're designing for is people who are sick. We're designing for people who don't feel their best. And this was something that was raised to me by the Canadian Mental Health Association. Remember, if you're designing for mental health, you're often going to be designing for someone who needs information in a crisis. If you're designing for cardiovascular medications and reminders and you want them to have that list when they need it, when they go to emerge, you're designing for a person who's probably going to be getting that information mid-heart attack. So you need them to get in. They don't have time to reset passwords and wait for them to come and email. They need that information right now. So this also brings up the information of who needs the information. You need it quickly. You need it when you're having challenges. You need it when you have disability. So what we have in mobile health, from a privacy security standpoint, is a very fine balance. On the one hand, we have usability and urgency. You've got to get in, it's got to be excellent, it's got to be a good experience, and you need to get it fast. On the other hand, you have security. The thing about security is we protect data by making it hard to get in and by slowing it down. There's a disconnect there. Mobile health is big business. So healthcare is a public industry, really, in Canada. Mobile healthcare is a private industry. According to IMS Health, in 2013, there were 43,000 health and fitness apps in the market. MyFitnessPal, just a show of hands, who uses this? Yeah, this is one of the most popular ones. A lot of people use this. Of those kinds of apps, though, 16,000 focus on consumer health care, treatment, giving you information. So even from this picture, with the lighting, it's a little bit hard to see, but the very first app on there is a pregnancy one. That's a great example. People can track pregnancies. That's sensitive information if you haven't told your partner that you're pregnant yet, or your parents that you're pregnant yet, or your employer that you're pregnant yet. This is an example of a diabetes app. So 2,000 of these apps collect data from people. So they're actually getting them to put information in. Again, if your employer doesn't know you have diabetes, this is important. If you're often going low in your blood sugars and somebody's going to pass judgment on you like your insurance company, that's private information. This is an arthritis app where what you do is you go in and you have this body and you can point, for your own tracking when you're having an inflamed or a painful joint. Again, people lose jobs on things like this. I have a friend who had cancer. Her employer, once realizing that the chemo and whatnot was going to really drive up the premiums for their small business, fired her because of that. Now legally, lucky for her, she was married to a lawyer. He couldn't do that. But that doesn't change the fact that discrimination happens very much around health information, and not always when you think. So this is sensitive personal information, and it must be protected. But we need to be mindful that with age comes physical changes to hearing and vision and cognition and the way we move. With disease, we have changes, so people have an essential tremor or Parkinson's disease or any sort of a physical disability that comes from that. And then we also have different abilities that underlie all these conditions, and that's what we're designing for. So changing gears a little bit, what we need to consider is how do we secure this information? So and I shared this on Twitter, there's a really good paper written by some researchers at Microsoft and from Carleton University called An Administrator's Guide to Internet Password Research. And one of the great things about this paper is it really highlights the fact that actually the security should be happening on the back end. The best way to protect these things is to have passwords that are salted and hashed and all these other technical things that a pharmacist has no business talking about. But there's a lot of engineering that's meant to happen on the back end. But what we do is instead of putting it on the back end, we actually put it on the user. And in my world, the user can't hold that burden. They can't carry that burden. So what we do is when we put it on the user, we ask them to give us, say, something they know, like a password, something they have, like a token or an encrypted phone or a device or something they are, like a fingerprint or an iris scan or a facial recognition. As it gets more and more sensitive, we have multi-factor authentication. So we want your device and your password. We want a fingerprint and a password, whatever. So let's break down what some of these options are. So the simple password is the thing that you use when you really don't care. For me, this is something like Pinterest. Go ahead and hack my Pinterest. I don't care. There's nothing in there that's important to me. So that might be a time when I use a simple password, a PIN, like a 4-digit number, or a word, Henry, Jane, sunshine, whatever. It's fast and it's easy to remember. And it's also easier to guess. So you are opening yourself up to risk if someone wants to attack that website or that device. They just go and all those hacked passwords that are out there on the internet, they start with the most popular and they work their way down and they get in pretty quickly. The word password is a simple password. The nice thing here is you have a high usability, and it's good when you don't care about the content, but you have low security, so it's not good for healthcare. So then the next option is a secure password. By definition, it's 7 or more characters, uppercase, lowercase, a number, or a symbol. Traditionally, we choose 8 characters, though. It's harder to remember, and that's part of what makes it more secure. It's difficult to guess. But again, people find workarounds, so the word password becomes PA, $W0RD. Start with that, and you can get into a lot of accounts. The other thing is when we make it difficult, like the emergency room physician I'm talking about, what we do is reuse passwords or we write them down. This is the point at which we create a workaround, and that matters because low usability seemingly corresponds with high security. And I'm going to refer you back, if this is an area you're at all interested in, to this paper on the Administrator's Guide to Internet Password Research, because one of the arguments is actually about a 6-digit PIN is when you max out on security in this level before, like, for the front-end attacks, and you actually have to go way further to get any additional benefit. So having an 8-character password, restarting it every 2 weeks, doesn't give you a heck of a lot of benefit compared to, say, a 6-digit PIN. But then we have these new areas like draw a secret, which is when you have those dots on an Android phone and you draw a pattern to get in. They can actually be very secure with certain rules. Photo recognition, where you give people a photo and it's broken down into grids and they pick out different pieces on that grid, or a grid of 9 by 9 pictures and they have to actually pick out 3 of the 81 pictures that you're going to get in there. What you're relying on there is something called pictorial superiority effect. Brains remember pictures better than they remember numbers and random phrases and stuff. We might store it in 2 different places. There's lots of theories around this. It's faster as well. It's more error-prone, but it's more forgiving for the user. They're more willing to do this multiple times because it's faster and it's easier. There are some concerns about this, like smudging on the screen or the risk of shoulder surfing. But generally speaking, it has high usability, and in many cases, it may actually have a security that's similar to those 8-digit ridiculous, irritating passwords. And then we get biometrics. So this has been termed the perennial technology of tomorrow, because it seems to be always around the corner and never really comes to fruition. Fingerprints, iris scans, heart rhythms, face recognition. No user memory is involved, which is great, especially in healthcare where you might have cognitive impairment. It's faster. The problem is people tend to perceive it as being much more secure than it actually is. So it has high usability, and we're still really working out how secure it is. So with that quick review, what we get to is now securing the device. Mobile health devices, mobile health apps are going to have sensitive information. The first thing is to get a user to secure that device. The problem is 1/3 of users do not secure their smartphones or tablets at all. So we can't assume that that device is actually going to be secure. So the next line is to secure the app itself. Recently, in the last couple of weeks, I had a student pull out free pill reminder apps. Now, as a pharmacist, if you come in to me and you show me your drug list, I can figure out a good chunk of what you're dealing with in your healthcare, right? I can piece together a lot of information. Anybody with a Google search engine can piece together a lot of information about you, sensitive information. So this, by definition, is an app where you would list all those pieces of sensitive information, maybe to have a reminder or order a refill. When we went in, 2/3 didn't even give the user a passcode option. 2/3 did not even give the user the option of a password. That is surprising to me. That is surprising to me. And I kind of started to think, am I the only one who's really looked at this? And no, and I'm missing an I on this person's name. It's correct online, but Karazi looked at this in 2012, 19 personal health records that are used on mobile devices. And they found 1/3 of those weren't giving people the option of a password. The future is here, it's just not widely distributed. This comes up all the time in tech conferences, but this is really true. Again, the biometrics, the perennial technology of tomorrow. It's always around the corner. So that is, for me as a pharmacist, I've had a lot to learn in privacy and security, and I work with cryptographers and security experts and trying to learn a language I don't speak. And I often feel like mobile health developers, they don't speak health, and I'm not so sure they speak security and privacy either. So what we have is a big problem. So our next year is focused on this research question, which is what are the most reliable authentication strategies for older adults who live with chronic disease? What we're asking is, we're asking people to try out a simple password, secure password, draw a secret, and fingerprint. And in our pilot testing, what we've seen is they have no idea things like the graphical passwords exist, but they way prefer them. So that's what we'll be doing over the next year. So again, I'll leave you with this bottom line. Mobile health information is private and needs to be secure, but to a person who is sick, accessibility is at least as important as security. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And I just want to say thank you to Madeline, who I see often and know has been working really hard on this symposium. So I'm here today to talk about genetic junk collection and the future of Canada's National DNA Databank. The overall point I'm going to make is that Canada's National DNA Databank was built based on the assumption that the portions of the genetic information that are examined in the criminal context were junk DNA, which means that sensitive medical information or other highly sensitive pieces of information could not be derived from the profiles that are uploaded onto the criminal databank. That assumption is now being called into question because it's becoming increasingly clear that even with the small portions of DNA that are examined for criminal purposes, there may be some additional types of information that can be derived, and there are some new types of analysis that can be applied to the to the portions of the genetic code that are examined. These bring on very interesting and important privacy implications and require us to think about how we want to regulate the future of those options in the criminal context. So to get to that point, I'm going to look very briefly at how genetic information is used in the criminal context and a little more closely at what I mean by junk DNA. I will also look very briefly at the boundaries on what is done with the information that's stored, the genetic information that's stored on the National DNA Databank in Canada, that I'll just call the NDDB from now on. And then I will get to some of the emerging uses of what we once called junk DNA to highlight the ways in which we need to think about the future of the National DNA Databank and the boundaries on what can and should be done with the information that's collected and stored in this context. So DNA, otherwise known as deoxyribonucleic acid, but thankfully can just be called DNA, is a substance that exists in all of our bodies that is very useful for medical purposes. So it's often described as a genetic map. The sequence that can be derived from your DNA is often described as a genetic map that tells your body how to look and function. So in the medical context, of course, that's extremely useful. It can say a lot about your propensity for different conditions, a lot about your medical health, and a lot of other information. Potentially the health of your future family members or past family members and you as an individual in the future. In the criminal context, DNA is primarily useful because it can identify a person if that person has left behind a piece of genetic material. And the identifying potential of DNA was discovered in 1984 by a man named Sir Alec Jeffreys in the UK. So what he discovered was that because of the way DNA is inherited, every individual has a unique genetic code. And that genetic code can be pulled from a piece of genetic material that the type of genetic material we leave behind every day and that many of us will leave behind in this room. Common examples at crime scenes are blood, saliva, hair, skin cells. So everyone is thought to have a unique genetic code that can be derived and put into a profile and examined from a piece of genetic material. The only exception is identical twins. So, and even that's being called into question in ways that I won't get into. But the way that you've inherited your DNA from your genetic parents, provides you with that unique genetic code that can be traced back to you specifically. And I apologize if there are any scientists in the room, because I find this Genetics 101 to be extremely fascinating, but, and I'm only going to give you some preliminary information, but you're probably used to seeing the genetic code represented in this double helix structure. Well, if you look more closely at the double helix structure, you see a collection of nucleotides that are represented by the letters GATC. And what's so fascinating to me, at least, is that we all have our own unique genetic code that is made up of just those 4 letters, GATC, in different combinations, and that they've been inherited in a proportion exactly 50% from each genetic parent. The proportion is exact. You've inherited half of your genetic code from your genetic mother and half of your genetic code from your genetic father. Now, if you look really closely at different parts of the genome or genetic sequence, you can see these 4 letters and the inheritance patterns. As an example, and a simplified example here, you might see at one portion on your genetic code the letters GATA repeated, I think I have it 12 times, and you would have inherited that, for example, from your genetic father, and a different sequence at the same location from your genetic mother. So in the criminal context, all of this is extremely useful because you can pull that profile from genetic material from any part of the genetic material on your body, pull it again from another part of your body, and it will be exactly the same. And you can even do that, of course, with many years between, and theoretically, it's going to be exactly the same genetic sequence that can be used to identify you if you've left behind a piece of genetic tissue at a crime scene. Now, the typical way that this is done at a crime scene, we've all seen on crime shows and movies, is that there will be a piece of anonymous crime scene tissue left behind, let's say a spot of blood. And analysts will pull the genetic profile from that genetic material, and then if they have a suspect, can look at the identified profile pulled from that suspect. If they are an exact match at approximately 13 loci, then they can conclude that that this material came from the same person. Now, the point to get to what junk DNA is that you only need to look at 13 different locations. Not every jurisdiction looks at the exact same number, but 13 locations the 13 specific locations have been chosen because by looking at just those locations, you can conclusively determine whether genetic material came from the same person. You don't have to look at the whole genetic code, in other words. So for the DNA Databank purposes in Canada, when the Databank was established to facilitate this kind of matching process in the criminal context, though only 13 core locations on the genetic profile were chosen, and those are derived from the crime scene tissue, derived from the tissue that's obtained from identified people, and uploaded can be compared to determine whether crime scene tissue belongs to a specific person. Those 13 locations were termed junk DNA because the idea was that they would certainly facilitate that matching process, but would not provide us with very sensitive medical information and other types of information that you just don't need to facilitate that matching process in the criminal context. The genetic tissue itself, that's a separate thing from the profile, can tell you a whole lot more. When Canada's National DNA Databank was established, there were a set of compromises. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada was very much involved in this consultation period to determine whether and to what extent we wanted to have a national DNA databank for criminal purposes. We do, the NDDB, but it is limited in many ways. I'd love to get into all of the ways in which it's limited because some of those limitations that were brought in under the DNA Identification Act are very meaningful in terms of balancing the privacy interests against the advantages for solving crimes that DNA provides. But the main limitation that I'm looking at here is that we looked at and still look at, for crime-solving purposes, the junk DNA, or what was known as junk DNA. With that junk DNA, there are two permissible uses of the information that's stored on the databank. And one of the limitations that I do want to mention is that the identified information on the databank belongs only to convicted offenders. We don't take genetic information from arrestees. We don't upload it onto the databank, and we don't upload information from, let's say, volunteers who have provided a sample to exclude themselves from an investigation. With the junk DNA, what can be done is to compare the crime scene index that holds anonymous information from crime scenes and the convicted offenders index. If you find a perfect match at those locations, the core locations, you have very compelling evidence that a certain person was at a crime scene, and investigators will have a suspect. The other permissible use is to compare the crime scene index, the anonymous information, with the crime scene index. So comparing two anonymous samples, which might be useful in terms of identifying a serial offender or linking two crimes together. But other than that, the DNA Identification Act restricts the ways in which the information collected for criminal purposes can be used. Again, in many ways. We don't perform research just for the purpose of conducting research on that information. We don't currently do familial searching, which is something that I'll get into in just a moment. But the point is that with that junk DNA, it's becoming increasingly clear that we might be able in the future to do much more than just compare and determine whether there is a match. And that brings on the question that I'm posing but not trying to solve today, which is, how far do we want to go in using the information, the profiles that have been uploaded, to extract information that would be admittedly very useful for criminal investigators, but in some cases very private. So one example is phenotyping, and there's continuing research on phenotyping and whether it can be done. Certainly there are advancements on the genetic sample that contains a lot more information, but there is research trying to determine what can be done in terms of phenotyping on the crime scene profiles. And phenotyping just refers to an analysis of a sample, or of a profile, or a sample, to determine physical characteristics of a person. So if you have an anonymous crime scene sample and you can draw out physical characteristics of that person, theoretically you could develop a picture of the suspect, and that would obviously be very useful to criminal investigators who are at a stop in an investigation and have nothing more to go on. Examples of the kinds of characteristics that are being studied now are eye color, from at least the genetic sample, skin tone. There are all kinds of other examples, whether your earlobes are attached or detached, baldness and hair loss patterns, whether a person may be likely to have red hair and freckles, those kinds of things. So we have to consider whether in the future we would allow this type of thing on the National DNA Databank information. The idea now is that our act, the DNA Identification Act, does not allow phenotyping, and that's because phenotyping science is really only useful right now, today, when you have the genetic sample. So it appears to have an implicit prohibition on phenotyping in that our act only allows comparison for the purposes of determining a match. It may be possible that it could be performed on the locations that we examine from the profiles that are uploaded. The second example is medical analysis. So analysis of the profiles to determine medically relevant information, a person's propensity towards a certain condition. That could potentially be very useful to investigators who have no further leads and could benefit from information about a suspect's likelihood of having or developing a certain medical condition. Again, this is in very early stages, and on the profiles as they exist right now, it's not likely that it would be possible to conclusively draw out that information. But in the event that it can be done in the future, we again need to ask ourselves whether we want to expand the National Databank to allow this kind of analysis in the name of facilitating investigative work, or whether we want to protect against the very important privacy implications of this type of analysis. Now, the third example that I'm bringing in here and going to focus on just a little more closely is familial searching. And I focus on this example because it's very clear that we can do familial searching on the profiles as they exist now on the National Databank. So if you'll take a look at my impressive artwork, I hope there are no graphic designers in the room, and if there are, I won't tell you how long it took me to put this together, but I really felt the need to have some visual representation of how this works. So familial searching, you'll remember that I talked about the inheritance of your genetic information. You've inherited those combinations of the letters GATC on your genetic code, and they can be examined to show your unique genetic profile. Because you've inherited these characteristics or your genetic code from your genetic parents, if you were child A, your genetic profile would necessarily be very similar to your genetic father's genetic profile and to your genetic mother's genetic profile, at least 50% similar. Maybe more, because there are certain characteristics that pass commonly through the population and maybe in addition to that 50% just by chance. But the point is that it's possible for analysts to look at the two profiles, yours and the profile of your genetic mother, and make a very good guess about whether there's a genetic relationship between the two of you. Because of the way genes are passed in families, child B and child A would also have very similar profiles, and it would, again, to a lesser extent, but still be possible to look at the profiles of these two children and determine whether there is a likelihood of a genetic relationship. So familial information, familial genetic information, and everything that it entails is, brings on some significant privacy concerns. This one example of what can be done with the junk DNA is something that could theoretically be performed on Canada's National DNA Databank data tomorrow. It's possible to do this, and we know how to do it, and many jurisdictions do. So for example, this is something that's commonly done in the UK. Many US jurisdictions are allowing familial searching in certain circumstances, and it's becoming increasingly common on the international stage. Canada does not allow familial searching of the National DNA Databank. There's a prohibition on doing anything other than using the information for the purposes of determining whether two samples or two profiles are an exact match. So we would require an amendment to our legislation. And that's part of the benefit of having had that consultation process that established Canada's National DNA Databank and set out certain limitations that balance the privacy concerns with the crime-solving benefits. So I think we're in a very good position, not only with familial searching, but with the other examples, to sit back and ask what we want to do with that information. Certainly there are instances where phenotyping, medical analysis, and familial searching would have clear benefits in the criminal context. They might help solve crimes. But there are also very important privacy implications and other implications, potential charter challenges and policy issues to discuss. So the fact that we do not do this, that we have legislation that says we cannot do this without an amendment, puts us in a position to ask what we want to do with the junk DNA that it turns out is not so junky after all. So while I don't attempt to solve each one of these problems and suggest that we do or do not allow this in any circumstance, I do present this as evidence of the fact that junk DNA is probably going to be much more useful than we first imagined. And for that reason, there are many important legal questions on the horizon as the science continues and we find out exactly what we can do with the limited profiles that are stored on Canada's DNA Databank. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.